Welcome to week 9 of the year 3 reading sessions. This week we're going to be discussing chapter 4. However, I'm not going to start at the very beginning of the chapter. So if you haven't already watched the video where I read chapter 4 to you, if you could watch that first, that would make everything much clearer for you. Chapter 4 contains loads of imagery. J.K. Rowling has used lots and lots of similes and metaphors to help make her writing more interesting. But what exactly is imagery? What is this? If you want to answer the questions before you find the answers, if you think you know, pause the video. Imagery is language which creates a picture in your imagination. So something which is described in great detail and allows the reader to build up that image. Here are some examples, you may have heard of them already. Similes and metaphors. I've got some text here, so I'm going to open it and read it, and then you're going to have a think about what similes and metaphors you can find inside it. Having spent the afternoon clearing the shed for Mrs. Stern, who was as strong as an ox, so didn't really need my help, I sat down at the foot of the stairs to catch my breath. After a few minutes, I stood to leave, when all of a sudden I heard something coming down the stairs like a rumbling avalanche. And then I was attacked by a large mass of curly hair. If you'd like to have a go at reading it and finding them and want a bit more time, then pause the video now. Here is a website which is the BBC Bite Size, which gives you more opportunities to watch video clips and see if you can pick out the similes and metaphors. And there's also a simile and metaphor game. Here are the examples of imagery that we talked about before. As strong as an ox, the foot of the stairs, and like a rumbling avalanche. So which ones are similes and how do you know? And which ones are metaphors? Well, similes compare something to something else, an object or perhaps an animal, and they use the words as or like, so they're not saying it is one of those objects directly, they're saying it's similar to. For example, as strong as an ox or like a rumbling avalanche. What is a metaphor? A metaphor is a more direct comparison. For example, the foot of the stairs. Now, if you've looked at the staircase, you'll know that there aren't actually feet like human feet. The foot means the bottom of the stairs. But the feet, obviously, are at the bottom of the body if you're standing upright. So that's why they've used the word foot of the stairs. But they haven't said it's like the feet, they've said it is, so it's direct. How will this help me to understand the text? So why is it important to learn about imagery, similes and metaphors, etc.? Well, lots and lots of writers use imagery to help us build up a picture of what's going on. It helps us to understand the storyline, it helps us to understand the characters, it helps us to really understand what's going on. If we don't understand the imagery, if we can't read the imagery and understand the information it's telling us, then it will make it much harder for us to enjoy stories or understand the information that we're getting from the text. So it's really important that we understand what imagery is and how it is useful. Okay, so we're going to start off with some retrieval of imagery. Have a look at this text. I'll read it out in a moment. What are the stranger's eyes compared to? So you'll start your sentence answer with, they are like. Here's the text. A giant of a man was standing in the doorway. His face was almost completely hidden by a long shaggy mane of hair and a wild tangled beard, but you could make out his eyes glinting like black beetles under all the hair. So this is the stranger that appears in chapter 4. What are the stranger's eyes compared to? Well, hopefully you've spotted they were compared to black beetles. Now it says glinting like black beetles. If you look carefully at this picture, you can see just how shiny the back of the beetle's shell or outer layer. So obviously it's very easy to spot his eyes, because if something shines out, you're more likely to notice it. So that's a really important feature of the text there. Okay, so it's not just retrieving information. When we talk about imagery, you can use your inference skills to answer questions too. The question is, what does the phrase "bent into a knot easily as if it had been made of rubber" suggest about Hagrid? So let me read the text. "Ah, shut up, Dursley, you great prune," said the giant. He reached over the back of the sofa, jerked the gun out of Uncle Vernon's hand, bent it into a knot as easily as if it had been made of rubber, and threw it into a corner of the room. Well, it doesn't tell us exactly what Hagrid is like, but it gives us an example to make it very clear. So in my head, I'm just imagining someone holding a gun, a long gun, and actually bending it into a knot. Now, sometimes I struggle to unbend a paperclip if I needed to use it for something, or something else that's made of metal, which guns are made of. So in my mind, clearly, this is not an easy thing to do, but it goes on to say he bent it into a knot as easily as if it had been made of rubber. Now, whenever I've had any rubber tubing, for example, like a piece of rubber hose that you might use in the back garden to water the plants, you can coil that round your arm or your hand quite easily. And it's very different to what I'd imagine a gun would be like. So if he's doing that, if he's finding it easy to tie it into a knot, it must tell me that Hagrid is actually very strong. And if you have a look at this picture here, that's really what I was imagining in my head that Hagrid had managed to do. So what does the phrase "bent into a knot easily as if it had been made of rubber" suggest about Hagrid? It suggests he's very strong because rubber is very easy to tie into a knot, but metal, which a gun is made of, is not. Okay, here is a new skill that we haven't really talked about much in Year 3, but we are going to do a little bit of this each week now. It's evaluation. And evaluation means to say whether we think something is good, not so good, and explain our thoughts about that. We're going to have a look at this piece of text. The question is, why is prune a good object to compare Mr. Dursley with? "Ah, shut up, Dursley, you great prune," said the giant. So this is what Hagrid calls Mr. Dursley. Now, can you remember, is it going to be a simile or a metaphor? It is actually a metaphor because he's not saying you're like a great prune. He's saying he is a prune, you great prune. Now, have a look at the picture of the prune below because you might not have eaten a prune before. Prunes are dried plums, a bit like grapes, which are a smaller fruit, are dried. When dried become raisins, plums become prunes. And if you look at the shape of the prune, it's very round, which is a good comparison to Mr. Dursley because, as we've already known, he's a very beefy, round man with hardly any neck. And it's also quite wrinkled. And when we think of wrinkles, we think of perhaps people that are a lot older than Harry. So this is a really good comparison because it's very round and it's got lots of wrinkles, which makes him sound big and beefy like he is, and quite old, as we know he is. So here we have some questions about the text on the right-hand side. So I'm going to read through the text and then we're going to come back to the task. Harry looked up at the giant. He meant to say thank you, but the words got lost on the way to his mouth, and what he said instead was, "Who are you?" The giant chuckled. "True, I haven't introduced myself. Rubeard Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts." He held out an enormous hand and shook Harry's whole arm. "What about that tea then, eh?" he said, rubbing his hands together. "I'd not say no to summat stronger, if you've got it, mind." His eyes fell on the empty grate with the shrivelled crisp packets in it, and he snorted. He bent down over the fireplace. They couldn't see what he was doing, but when he drew back a second later, there was a roaring fire there. It filled the whole damp hut with flickering light, and Harry felt the warmth wash over him, as though he'd sunk into a hot bath. Okay, so let's look at the grid on the left. So you can see there's some pieces of text. And what we need to do is tick the box to show whether it was Hagrid that the statement was about or Harry. So the giant chuckled. You can probably spot that sentence quite quickly. It's quite near the beginning of the text. Here it is. And of course it is about Hagrid. And I know that it's about Hagrid because it says the giant chuckled. And we know that Harry is still quite a young boy. He's not an adult yet. And he doesn't know this person's name, which is why they're still calling him the giant or the stranger, even though he's about to find out that the person's name is Hagrid. Second statement says, felt warmth wash over him. So here it is in the text. We know it's about Harry because, as you can see in the circled part, it says Harry felt the warmth wash and then over him on the next line. Okay, next one, he couldn't speak. Now, it doesn't say the exact words couldn't speak, but as you can see in the circle at the very top, it says, but the words got lost. Now, words are not human beings. They can't get lost, really. This is actually another type of imagery called personification. However, if something gets lost, it means it doesn't happen. So we know if words are getting lost, they're not being said. It says, but the words got lost on the way to his mouth. So those words got lost, they haven't been said. So that means it must have been Harry that couldn't speak. And the last bit, he started a fire. Let's find the section of text. Here it is. It says his eyes fell on the empty grate with the shrivelled crisp packets in it and he snorted. He bent down over the fireplace. They couldn't see what he was doing, but when he drew back a second later, there was a roaring fire there. Now, even though it doesn't say he started the fire, we know there was no fire. Hagrid bent down over it and they couldn't see anything. And then when he stood back, there was a fire. So it couldn't have been Harry or any of the others. It must have been Hagrid. Okay. Here are 4 questions. I'm going to read through the text one more time. The first question is, what is Hagrid's job? As we're reading through it, see if you can find that information. Harry looked up at the giant. He meant to say thank you, but the words got lost on the way to his mouth, and what he said instead was, who are you? The giant chuckled. True, I haven't introduced myself. Rubeus Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts. He held out an enormous hand and shook Harry's whole arm. What about that tea then, eh? He said, rubbing his hands together. I'd not say no to something stronger, if you've got it, mind. His eyes fell on the empty grate with the shrivelled crisp packets in it, and he snorted. He bent down over the fireplace. They couldn't see what he was doing, but when he drew back a second later, there was a roaring fire there. It filled the whole damp hut with flickering light, and Harry felt the warmth wash over him, as though he'd sunk into a hot bath. Hopefully you found that Hagrid's job is the keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts. Okay, the next question was, how do you know Hagrid is strong? Use evidence from the text. Now, before I go any further and give the answer, if you would like to have a go and try and find the evidence before I give my answer, you can pause the video and then keep playing it to see if you were right. Okay, so underneath the last piece of evidence, it says he held out an enormous hand and shook Harry's whole arm. Normally, when you shake hands with someone, you don't shake it so they feel it in their whole arm. You probably feel it in your wrist and your hand as you give them a little shake. But here it says that Hagrid had an enormous hand and he shook Harry's whole arm. So this shows me that Hagrid must be quite strong and he's probably using his strength and doesn't realise how much stronger he is than the people who he's shaking hands with. Okay, next question. What does felt the warm wash over him like a warm bath tell you about how Harry feels? Okay, well there's a few things that we need to think about here. We know having a warm bath is something people either do to clean themselves or they do it to relax. Now, if we're talking about feelings, we're probably not worrying about whether people are clean or not. We're really worrying about how they feel. And we know that a warm bath is very relaxing. At the beginning, it says the words got lost on the way to his mouth, which shows me that he couldn't quite get his words out. He didn't know what to say. Maybe he was a bit worried, a bit anxious, a bit nervous. But this part of the text, felt the warm wash over him as though he'd sunk into a hot bath, tells us he's feeling more relaxed. So let's go through the question again. What does felt the warm wash over him like a warm bath tell you about how Harry feels? It tells me that Harry felt anxious and worried to begin with when he couldn't speak properly, and then by the end, all the things that Hagrid said and did relaxed him, especially as he warmed up the hut with the fire that he brought. So Harry is now feeling much better than he did when Hagrid first arrived. And the last question. Why is the words got lost on the way to his mouth a good way to describe Harry trying to speak? We've already mentioned this part of the text before. And as I said to you before, this is actually personification. It's making something that isn't like a human or an animal seem like it's acting like a human. The words got lost on the way to his mouth. Sounds a bit like when someone's walking somewhere and they don't know which way to go. They don't actually know where they are. This is a good way to describe Harry trying to speak, because if you get lost, it takes a lot longer to get to where you want to get to. So it gives the impression that it took quite a long time, and if you're nervous and worried, it does take a long time to think about what it is that you want to say and get it out. So it's a really good way of showing how much effort and time it took for Harry to actually say something to Hagrid, even though he was feeling nervous and anxious.